I'm Sasha, everyone. Welcome to Welcome Change. I work at Ashoka. I'm usually based in Berlin. Today I'm in Hamburg, and I'm incredibly excited to have Christiana Bukalo here today to talk about statelessness and what I hope will be a conversation about what participation really means. I want to start by introducing my dogs because every morning when I walk my dogs, I walk past a big billboard, a huge billboard on my street that says that Prince has lived in Germany for 30 years. He is stateless. And Christiana brings what appears to be in many ways the bottom of the human rights pyramid to life. And by definition, in my understanding, and Christiana will explain this to us in real expert detail, stateless people cannot vote, and they're mostly only tolerated in the places they live. And they live in isolation because by definition also they're not a community or a diaspora or a connected community. But with Statefree, the organization that Christiana founded, they do create change and they do connect. And so I want to start by saying welcome, Christiana, to Welcome Change.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
It's just such a privilege to have you here. Christiana is a recently elected Ashoka Fellow in Germany. And Christiana, I have to start with that kind of very simple question to all of us who are uninitiated. What is statelessness?
Yeah, it's a very important question also because there might be very different interpretations of what statelessness might mean. So the basic definition is that a stateless person is a person who is not recognized as a citizen by any nation. And that is important because with statelessness and also with citizenship, it's not about whether or not you feel like you belong to a certain country or you feel close to a certain nation, but it's a one-way street. So it is the country, the state that decides whether or not you are recognized as a citizen. And one of the main problems is that oftentimes people who have citizenship don't notice that a lot of the very basic human rights that a lot of people have access to are actually not only human rights in the sense that they are accessible to us because we're human beings, but they're actually accessible to us because we are citizens of a nation. So stateless people face the issue that they have very limited access to very basic human rights. So depending on the country they live in, they might not be able to go to school, they might not be able to work, they don't have the right to travel a lot of times. They face issues when it comes to access to health services. They don't have the right to vote. So while they are 100% impacted by the decisions that are being made in politics, they have zero option of actually impacting what is happening on the political level. And currently there is an estimate of up to 15 million people worldwide who are stateless. And that is a huge number. And still we oftentimes really don't know that there is this group that exists.
And Christiana, you're not a human rights lawyer. How did you get involved and why did you get involved in this topic?
Yeah. Also very important question. So I think there are two parts to this question. So one that is that I have my personal experience of statelessness. So I'm a stateless person who was born in Germany. My parents came to Germany from West Africa about 32 years ago. I'm now 30. I just turned 30 a couple of days ago. And I'm still stateless, despite the fact that I was born in Germany. And so I always had a connection to the issue, but it also took a while until I actually understood what statelessness is, which is also one of the reasons that we're doing this work. But my personal experience of statelessness is not really the main reason that I started this work, because I'd rather say that it's exactly the opposite. So me being stateless always led to me wanting to focus more on the positive side of things and positive issues. But what happened was that, excuse me, a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, I planned to travel to Morocco. And before traveling, I researched how I would be able to get into the country. And that is mainly because I didn't have the right to travel until I turned 18. So that was the first time I actually received a travel document. And I researched beforehand how I would be able to enter the country. I couldn't find any information, but I could see that the tourist website shared that people that traveled from Germany, that's how I interpreted it, that they were able to enter the country. And as I have only lived in Germany my whole life, and all of my documents are issued by German authorities, I felt like this is what I could compare myself to. So I traveled to Morocco, and in Marrakesh at the airport, they informed me that I would not be able to enter the country, and that they had already booked the next flight back to Germany, which only left on the next day. So I had to spend 20 hours at the airport in Marrakesh. And that was a very, very harsh reality check, and also in some sense traumatizing experience, because it made me realize that even after the sum of years that I've spent in Germany and after all that I've done in a sense, and I think there is this image of a model migrant, right? So me speaking German as first language, going to university and so forth. And despite all of that, I'm still stateless, and I still don't have the freedom to decide what I'm doing. And after that experience, I researched more about statelessness and understood that there's a huge scale and also the scope of this issue, that there are so many people who are affected. And I have two younger sisters, so I'm kind of an overprotective older sister, and I felt like I didn't want this to happen to anyone else ever, which is a huge goal, but that's why I actually got involved in this work.
Wow, yeah. I looked at your LinkedIn profile earlier, and there it is. You studied media and public relations, and you worked for all kinds of great companies, and then suddenly you see this break in your biography where you get involved in nonprofits, where you get involved in of course the topic of migration and statelessness. Um, I want to just kind of mirror back in a way of looking at the story you were sharing, which is that in many ways, starting with yourself, you saw not just that there is this condition of statelessness that you yourself, even though this is a defining feature of you, and thank God you made it your life's purpose not to be defined by it. But actually, that also made you more isolated, right? Because you were so focused on building a normal life that you, in a way, detached from the condition. And so tell us a little bit how then you're building a community. You said there are 15 million stateless people out there. And one of the purposes of Statefree, your organization, is to connect them. And I think the second purpose is to give them a space for action and a way of creating change. Can you explain a little bit about how Statefree works?
Yes, I'm very happy to. So we have made it our goal to empower stateless people in the sense that we have this vision of stateless people at some point regaining pride in their identity, because oftentimes what is being internalized is I'm stateless, I don't exist, I'm invisible, and all of those very negative narratives. And we want to transform the way that stateless people think about themselves so that we can also transform the way that the world thinks about stateless people. And we, as the word empowerment is used very often, we for ourselves define like what does empowerment look like for us and how can we work on this issue. And we define three pillars. So the one is community, because statelessness can be a very isolating experience, and it is important for us to understand that there are many of us. The second one is visibility, because it's a very invisible issue, and there's no way of solving a problem without knowing that it exists. Currently, neither politicians nor the broader society actually understands that statelessness exists. And the third part is equal rights, because we also understood we can create as much community as we want to. True freedom comes with access to basic rights, and that is very important. And for that, it's important to change the system, the structure that stateless people live in. And I think one more important thing to mention when it comes to the community part, or maybe also to the three pillars, is that when we talk about stateless people, and you mentioned that partly also in the introduction, we're talking about an extremely diverse group of people. There are a lot of reasons for statelessness. There are a lot of different biographies. So there are people like myself who were born stateless, and that is because statelessness is something that is inherited. But then there are people who became stateless throughout their life because of war and political conflicts. So we see people from the former Soviet Union, from former Yugoslavia, from Palestine who are stateless. So those are people who became stateless throughout their life because of the political conflicts that they were living in. Then we also have discriminatory nationality law. So we have over 25 countries that don't allow women to pass on the nationality on to their children. So if, for example, an Iranian woman gives birth to a child in Germany, and the father doesn't recognize the child, this child then ends up being stateless. So we have very, very different groups of stateless people, and it is very important for us when we think about creating solutions for those people. It is important to talk to those who are affected because the experiences can be so different. And when I started researching statelessness, I did find two larger organizations in the sector that work on statelessness. And me, out of the perspective of a stateless person, I thought when I reach out to those organizations, they would then introduce me to the 15 million stateless people. So I sent them an email asking whether we could meet. And when I had my first conversation with them, I understood that there is no stateless person in those settings. So even within the sector that works on statelessness, stateless people are still underrepresented, which didn't make sense for me. So when we think about those three pillars, community, visibility, and equal rights, for us, it's important that however we approach those areas is driven by how the community actually wants us to approach those areas and by their needs and perspectives.
In our just in our conversation as we were preparing for the call, you shared with us that on Friday it's a big day in Germany where there's some possible changes to the naturalization laws, the citizenship laws. I don't want to go in there because you described, how it's a little bit like no one knows what will happen on Friday, right? You've got proposals in there that you presented. The political environment is complicated right now. But I want to talk about two things really. One is the journey, right? So your journey to kind of start thinking about statelessness happened a crisis in your life. You were at an airport and it was all there and you had to deal with it. And I wonder what it looks like now for people who join Statefree, what their journey looks like. And then the second part, evidently, as a community, you're proposing these legal changes and policy changes. Those are things you cannot control, right? We talked about this, it's out of your control. But what in your community is within your control? How can you create the sense of self-efficacy of a little bit about that relationship?
So the first question about the journey. So currently, so my journey was very lonely, meaning that I, for example, reached out to different German local offices. Nobody responded. I also had to research a lot until I understood that statelessness was actually what affects me. Currently, with our work, the journey would be it's kind of twofold. So there's one group that has an urgent issue and they need legal support. Those are often people who approach us because they can't find anyone else. We've even had cases in which parliamentarians ask them to reach out to us, or the local, like the foreigners office, ask them to reach out to us because we would be the ones who can support them. So there's this group. And then there's the group that has understood their statelessness and now wants to speak up about their statelessness. With the first group, we have some limitations because the environment and the structures that we are working in are still there's so little knowledge on statelessness. So what we do is we support as far as we can. We also share advice in terms of how to deal with different issues, but we also support them in asking other members of the community how they could actually solve their issue. With the second group, and oftentimes people from the first group kind of merge into the second group as soon as we've supported them with their like very pressing issue. So they then understand, okay, this is something that affects me. It's a structural issue, and it's the fault of certain. It's not my own fault. It's the fault of the structure that we're living in. I now want to become more visible, and I want to also have impact when it comes to the change that I want to see. So what happens then is that stateless people or members of our community can then be involved in the different areas of our work. So when it comes to, for example, the community, we have meetings that we call community labs. In those labs, we come together to co-create something. And we ask them what their needs are and what they want to do. Because I remember, I think it was like 1.5 years ago when we started our political advocacy, we obviously wanted our community members to be part of the political work. So we asked them who wanted to be part of that work and also maybe wanted to join meetings. And nobody raised their hands. Nobody wanted to. And I understand because there is a complete lack of trust, not only in those who are working in those decision-making positions and powers, but also lack of trust into the system, right? Why would I spend my time volunteering and working on advocacy, although I've never, ever had any support from politics? So they didn't want to work on politics, but they did want to work on media. So what we decided then is that we created our first mini podcast series together with Stateless community members. So that was the first co-created podcast series that we developed together with them. We brainstormed together with them and produced it with them. Now, 1 year into this work, they have gained trust when it comes to political work. And that's also when the journey around the Citizenship Act started, which was that they wanted to co-create those proposals with us. We had different discussions with them. And we even brought them together with the parliamentarians. So we organized a so-called state-free dinner in which we allowed parliamentarians to meet stateless people from Germany so that they actually understand what statelessness means in Germany. And so that they had the opportunity, so members of our community had the opportunity to talk directly to parliamentarians about what their needs are, about what needs to change and why it is important to make statelessness more visible in our legal structures.
Wonderful. Thank you. So we're getting, I'm seeing some wonderful audience questions coming in. Before we go there, I have one last question. You're not a global migration expert or human rights lawyer like we established. In a way, you've tried to build a career that avoids these issues as much as possible. And my question to you is, do you sometimes feel like an imposter when you're an expert witness to the government and parliamentarians, when you're advising others? You mentioned in your prep call that often you meet experts on statelessness who don't really know as much as you do. Because I feel oftentimes a lot of us feel like that, we're entering spaces that we're not professionally prepared for. So I wanted to ask you, do you sometimes feel like that? And clearly you're very successful in not being intimidated by that. So what advice would you have for people who feel like that, who don't feel formally qualified and yet totally engaged in the issue at hand?
Yeah. So I often feel like an imposter, but I don't feel like an imposter when it comes to this work on statelessness or my expertise on statelessness. And I think that is really very much tied to my lived experience. It took a while, but statelessness is an issue that is barely really understood by those who are not experiencing it, because it is just like, it's just so normal to people to have a citizenship. So at some point, I noticed that sometimes when I ask questions, people were kind of ignoring questions or giggling or not responding. And I always thought that's because my question is stupid. But at some point, I learned more about statelessness and understood that's because they don't have the response to my question. There's no answer to it. So, and that's also one thing that we work a lot on with our community members, making them understand that they are the experts of their own experience. And obviously, there are very different experiences when it comes to statelessness, but oftentimes the experience that they have can then be extended by the legal knowledge and the structures, but the experience itself is more knowledge than just reading a paper on what statelessness could mean and what the reasons for statelessness are. So my advice in general is, if it's if you have lived experience with something, just make yourself aware of the fact that you are the expert of your own experience. Nobody can take that away from you, and everything else you can learn. But it's hard to learn a lived experience because you have to live it and experience it. And then the other part is that I also often I don't want to say struggle, but the term expert and also maybe how to identify with this word, I don't really care too much about being an expert. I believe that there is always more to know and learn and understand. And that's also how we work at Statefree. We always work with other partners. We always work with other groups because we believe that there is a lot of knowledge that can only complement what we're doing. So I don't even want to be an expert in the sense of I know everything, but I'm just open to everything new there is. But I am an expert in those things that I know, and I'm also very honest about things that I just don't know. And I don't know everything about migration. I don't know everything about asylum rights, but I do know a lot about statelessness, and I'm very happy to share that.
Yeah, I think in other words, in a way, what you're describing is this kind of zombie problem, right? It's kind of no one created this condition,
Mm,
yet it is there. And when I look at some of the questions, on in the from our viewers and listeners, is we're unaware to this, right? When I walk past that poster about Prince, the
mm,
fact that he was born or that you were born in Germany and yet you inherit statelessness. I mean, this is no one in the world has decided it has to be this way.
mm,
And it's a little bit like rare diseases. Most people don't know they have them.
right.
And yet it produces all these unwanted outcomes. And that's why it's important that you're creating community awareness. And I love what you're saying about building the confidence in your lived experience. It's something so universal and important. I want to switch over to some of these questions we're getting in here. So I'll pick one. Uh, I'll pick a couple out that are linked together. One is about whether state-free works outside of Germany, and in particular whether state-free could happen, stateless women in Nepal. And then linked to it, that's a question from Kamala Budel. I hope I pronounce her name correctly. And my colleague Alessandro Valera, he asks whether there's a particular part of the world where most stateless people congregate. Are there hotspots where there's a higher density, or is this a problem that is more or less evenly spread around the world?
Yeah. So the first question, we don't only work in Germany, but we did have a very strong German focus currently because of the German Nationality Act. And but we actually started with like working internationally, meaning because for us, community means everyone, and we wouldn't create new borders in a sense. So the community is online community also is accessible for everyone in terms of Nepal. So we do also know other organizations that work on statelessness, which probably or would be way better equipped than we are at this moment to support. But definitely, so if there's a certain need, just feel free to maybe send us an email. And then we could maybe connect them to the other organization. Because I do believe that a local context is, and local knowledge is very important with statelessness. Um, then the second question about areas in which statelessness. So there are larger groups of stateless communities in a sense, because there are certain issues that then affect a larger group. So one definitely are the Rohingya in Myanmar. They were excluded from nationality law in 1982. So they are one of the largest groups. And then the second largest group is Palestinians. That is definitely because of the situation in Palestine. So a state needs to be recognized as a state in order to give citizenship to individuals and to civilians. Apart from that, I'd say I don't want to say it's evenly spread, because then again, a lot of countries don't even report on the numbers. So, for example, if we look at Europe, we know that so currently there is an estimate of 500,000 people who are stateless in Europe. But then we also know that, for example, let alone in Germany, there are 126,000 stateless people. So if we look at the whole continent, there might be a larger number of stateless people, but it is a very political decision also of countries to decide whether or not they report those numbers or not.
Yeah. So there's another question here, and I guess again we can connect them. One question is, how does the notion of national citizenship need to change in the world we're moving into? Is citizenship a limiting box? And related to that, what do you hope will be different in So the anonymous question here says, in 10 years, as a result of your community's creative and determined action, I would just say let's not worry about the 10 years. Let's if you could describe the kind of Christiana's utopia to celebrate your 30th birthday,
Yeah.
what would that look like?
Mm, okay, so switching back to this first question about citizenship being a box, that's very interesting way to put the question, because usually I'm asked about nation states and whether I want nations to disappear. So citizenship is like the legal bond between a country and an individual. I think there are certain ideologies, unfortunately, because we create belonging through states create belonging through citizenship. And unfortunately, they create belonging by othering. So by deciding who has the right to citizenship, they also say who doesn't has the right. So I think what would need to change is what we think the role of citizenship is, because best case citizenship plays the role of giving access to rights, but currently it is actually misused and abused as a political weapon to exclude people from those rights. So citizenship per se is nothing bad or good, but the way that we use it is something that could be challenged or should be challenged. In terms of what I'd like to change in the next 10 years, or maybe not 10 years, but my vision. So I think that statelessness exists is a very, yeah, it's a clear consequence of states existing. So if we have states and we have citizenship, we will always have the opposite of it. That's just how the world works. And I think that's okay-ish as long as we make sure that those who are stateless are those who are still being protected by states. So what currently happens is that this is a very vulnerable group, and instead of understanding that they're vulnerable and we need to save them, we actually exclude them even more and push them away. So what I would like to change is that there is an understanding of how vulnerable stateless people are, that we understand that those are still people who are part of our society and we need to support them, and then also that we create a path that leads them out of statelessness into citizenship, because we understand that our structures are here to support and protect every one of us, instead of only protecting a certain group that we decide is more valuable or more important.
Yeah, I mean, there's this shocking insight that you can be born in Germany to a stateless family and inherit that and pass it on to the next generation, I think is incredible. There's a question here about that, why you don't become a permanent, why didn't you don't automatically become a citizen or become a permanent resident? I want to kind of end, on a different question, and then we'll wrap up. The question here is, do illegal immigrants, and in quotation marks here, by the fact that they migrated illegally, generally become stateless? Or, do their countries of origin basically abandon them? Or do you think, and I think it's worth clarifying, because especially in the United States, of course, we talk a lot about undocumented migrants or immigrants. I think from what I've learned from you, there is a hierarchy between that, because there's still a country they came from. But yeah, so maybe you could just kind of clarify for audience a little bit, like these bordering scenarios, and then I would love to wrap us up.
Yeah, that's a tough question as the last question, because it is actually pretty complex. So statelessness means that you don't have a citizenship. Leaving a country doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have the citizenship anymore. It simply means that you're not in this country anymore. The thing is, there is sometimes stateless people are, or statelessness is kind of created with refugees, but statelessness can be a cause or a reason for fleeing a country, right? You might be forced to flee a country because you're stateless and your rights are not recognized, or you flee and then become stateless because for some reason then the country decides that they don't recognize you anymore. So illegal migrants in that sense are not the same as stateless persons. A stateless person is only a person that doesn't have a citizenship. So if you imagine you leave your home country, then you might not have all the relevant documents that you would have needed to get asylum somewhere else. If you are not stateless, you still have the possibility to go to that embassy and say, hey, I lost this document, I lost my birth registration, for example, or my birth certificate, can you please give it to me? And you were still registered because you're one of the citizens. For myself, for example, me being in Morocco, or also during COVID, for example, when it was a lot about traveling and who would be then able to travel back, I'm not a German citizen, right? So Germany has records of me, but that's simply because that's our culture in Germany. But then I don't have the same value to Germany as a person with a citizenship would have. And that makes me stateless. I hope that helped. And then undocumented, you can be undocumented and still have citizenship, but you can also be stateless and undocumented at the same time.
Yeah, thank you, Christiana. And of course, my colleague Kenny here rightfully, of course, pointed out that no one is illegal.
Thank you.
And we of course want to refer to people as having irregular migration scenarios or circumstances, and of course everyone is a legal person. And I want to close by maybe what I take away from Christiana, from this beautiful conversation with you, is that you're creating much more than just an answer to statelessness, but you're creating a model for self-representation and participation for groups that are marginalized and disadvantaged. And 15 million people is a large group, but of course it's also, when you spread that across the world, it's a very rare condition in some ways, and that's probably also why this group doesn't self-identify. And you're creating this identity, and you're opening this group up and exposing the rest of the world to the reality of this group by having parliamentarians meet and eat together and so forth. And for me, it kind of, it's just one of the pieces in a world that we would like to talk about, in a world where everyone can truly participate. And I think it's such a powerful example that shows how that participation created even from a place where there shouldn't be any rights to participate. And yet here we are, and you are changing things, and people have a sense of community and working together and achieving change. But also I think it reminds all of us, and it reminds me, that those of us who have a vote or who have privilege or who have any kind of capability have to keep looking out for those communities and understand our role in adding more to that participation, offering more, and creating more pathways to this empowerment and to this kind of world where everyone really feels invited and capable to contribute. So, Christiana, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation that touched on your personal experiences, on the complexity of statelessness and migration conditions, and your vision for the world. And I hope you can continue to celebrate your 30th birthday week. What an accomplishment you've already achieved, and we're so excited about what's to come. Thank you for joining us here on Welcome Change. And behind the scenes also, thank you to Mari and Hanai, who've put this wonderful session together.
Thank you for having me.